Son-of-a-gun stew. In the old cattle towns of the American West, nothing went to waste. When cowboys butchered cattle on the trail, every part of the animal was used. The result was a stew known as son-of-a-gun stew, a dish made from the organs that rarely reached proper butcher shops: tripe, liver, marrow gut, sweetbreads, and sometimes even the brain. These ingredients were simmered slowly with potatoes, onions, and whatever herbs were available. It wasn't a dish people asked too many questions about. You ate first, asked later. Out on the frontier, survival mattered more than preference. For many cowboys, this stew wasn't just food, it was fuel. Long rides, cold nights, and days of labor demanded meals that were high in calories and easy to share. Saloon cooks served it because it was affordable to make, hearty enough to satisfy, and familiar to men who spent weeks on the open range. In places like Dodge City and Abilene, finishing a full bowl of son-of-a-gun stew became a quiet sign of toughness. It meant you were part of the frontier, someone who understood the work, the hunger, and the land itself. Sourdough flapjacks. Sourdough flapjacks were one of the most reliable foods a cowboy could depend on. Long before diners and boxed pancake mixes, men on the trail carried sourdough starter in small tins tied to their saddlebags. The starter was alive, a fermented mixture of flour, water, and wild yeast that had to be fed and cared for. It was almost like a traveling companion, one that guaranteed a meal no matter how far from town you were. To make flapjacks, the batter was stirred with flour, water, and salt, then fried in a hot cast-iron skillet greased with bacon fat. The pancakes came out dense and slightly chewy, with a sour tang that came from weeks, or sometimes years, of fermentation. They weren't sweet breakfast pancakes like we think of today. These were working food, heavy, filling, and meant to sit in the stomach through hours of riding and labor. In saloons, they were often served with whatever was available: molasses, pork drippings, or canned fruit brought in by rail when supply lines allowed it. Cowboys ate them morning, midday, or in the middle of the night, depending on when they rode in from the trail. Some called them sinkers because they felt like they dropped straight to the bottom of your gut. But they kept you going, and on the frontier, that was all that mattered. Fried salt pork and beans. If there was one dish that defined frontier eating, it was fried salt pork and beans. Beans weren't just a stereotype, they were survival food. Cheap, filling, and easy to transport in bulk, pinto or navy beans were staples in almost every saloon west of the Mississippi. But beans alone weren't enough to keep a cowboy going. That's where salt pork came in. Salt pork was a heavily salted, fatty cut of meat that could keep for months in wooden barrels without refrigeration. Saloons sliced it thick, fried it in cast iron, and let the fat render down. The beans were simmered low and slow, sometimes for hours, until they turned creamy from the long cooking. Then the crisp pieces of salt pork and hot pork fat were spooned right over the top. If the saloon cook was skilled, the beans were flavored with molasses, onions, or a little black pepper. If times were harder, you just got beans and grease. Either way, it was a meal that stuck to your ribs and kept you moving from dawn until well past sundown. This was the kind of dish that didn't need a menu. A cowboy could walk in, throw a coin on the counter, and the cook already knew what to serve. It was dependable, nourishing, and deeply tied to the rhythm of the trail. Not fancy, not delicate, just honest fuel for hard lives. Chuckwagon coffee. Cowboy coffee wasn't brewed to taste good. It was brewed to work. Out on the frontier, sleep was short. Days were long, and mornings came early. Coffee helped keep men awake at the reins, alert on watch, and steady in the saddle. The brew was made in large tin pots, usually blackened from years of campfire smoke. Coarse coffee grounds were thrown directly into boiling water, stirred once, and left to settle however they could. Most cooks didn't bother with filters. To keep the grounds from floating, they might toss in crushed eggshells, a pinch of salt, or even a piece of dried rawhide to help the solids sink to the bottom. The result was strong, dark, and bitter, often described as thick enough to float a horseshoe. No two pots ever tasted quite the same. Some were harsh and smoky, others surprisingly smooth, depending on how long the pot had been sitting on the fire. In saloons, a pot of coffee was often kept hot throughout the day, topped off but rarely emptied. Cowboys drank it at sunrise before work, after meals, or late at night during card games. A tired rider might ask the barkeep to fix it, which meant adding a shot of whiskey, turning necessity into comfort. Chuckwagon coffee wasn't about enjoyment. It was about keeping going when the land was big, the work was hard, and the nights felt endless. Prairie oysters, Rocky Mountain oysters. Despite the name, prairie oysters had nothing to do with the ocean. They were bull testicles, cleaned, sliced, battered, and fried. This dish showed up in cattle towns, ranch cookouts, and saloons across Colorado, Wyoming, and Texas. When cowboys castrated young bulls to manage herds, no part of the animal went to waste. The organs were immediately washed, seasoned, and dropped into hot tallow. Frying transformed something many would normally avoid into a surprisingly tender, mild-tasting dish with a crispy outside and soft center. Saloons served prairie oysters with mustard, vinegar, hot sauce, or just a sprinkle of salt. Eating them became a badge of toughness. Refusing them could get a cowboy teased for weeks. To outsiders today, this dish might sound bizarre, but in the Wild West, practicality shaped the menu. Food wasn't about luxury. It was about using every resource available. Prairie oysters were proof of a frontier mindset. If it came from the herd and provided calories, it was valuable. And for cowboys who spent weeks eating beans and biscuits, a plate of freshly fried prairie oysters, even with the jokes that followed, was a welcome break from routine. Rabbit stew. When cattle was scarce or too expensive, cowboys didn't go hungry. They went hunting. Rabbits were everywhere across the plains, and they became a dependable source of meat for both trail cooks and small-town saloons. Rabbit stew was simple, hearty, and surprisingly comforting after long weeks on the range. The process started by browning the rabbit pieces in pork fat or tallow. The meat was lean, so the added fat helped soften it and deepen the flavor. Then everything went into a big pot with onions, potatoes, carrots, or whatever root vegetables were available. If a town was close to Mexico or native trade routes, the stew might include chilies, garlic, or wild herbs, turning each bowl into a regional variation. Rabbit stew simmered slowly, often for hours. The longer it cooked, the more tender the meat became, eventually falling off the bone. When a cowboy sat down with a steaming bowl and a wedge of cornbread or sourdough, it didn't feel like survival food. It felt like home, the kind of meal someone's mother or grandmother might make on a cold night. It wasn't a dish for celebrations. It wasn't meant to impress. It was meant to restore warmth, strength, and a sense of being cared for in a world where comfort was rare. Squirrel fricassee. Yes, squirrel. On the frontier, hunting wasn't a hobby. It was survival. In wooded regions like Missouri, Arkansas, and parts of Kansas, squirrels were everywhere, and they offered reliable protein when cattle was too valuable to slaughter and supplies were thin. So saloon cooks made use of what the land provided. Squirrel fricassee started with small cuts of squirrel meat, cleaned and portioned. The pieces were browned in a skillet with pork drippings or tallow, just enough to develop flavor. Then came the fricassee part. The meat was simmered slowly in a creamy gravy made from flour, milk, and pan drippings. Sometimes black pepper or wild herbs gave it a warm, peppery depth. It was usually served over biscuits or cornbread to stretch the meal further. This wasn't a dish a saloon advertised loudly. Outsiders, especially city travelers, might turn up their noses. But locals knew better. Squirrel could be tender, flavorful, and deeply satisfying when cooked right. Squirrel fricassee was community food, the kind of meal that came from shared land, shared hardship, and shared knowledge. It tasted like belonging, the kind of thing you only learned if you lived the life. Corn Dodger biscuits. Corn Dodgers were the cowboys' version of everyday bread, simple, durable, and made to travel. Flour was sometimes scarce on the frontier, but cornmeal was plentiful, so saloon cooks and trail hands used what they had. Corn Dodgers were made by mixing cornmeal with boiling water and a pinch of salt, sometimes enriched with bacon fat if the cook was feeling generous. The dough was shaped into small, oval cakes and either fried in a skillet or baked on hot stones by the fire. They were dense, firm, and slightly gritty, not soft like modern biscuits. But that was the point. Corn Dodgers didn't crumble. They didn't spoil quickly. A cowboy could shove a few in a saddlebag, ride through dust storms and river crossings, and still have something to chew on at sundown. In saloons, Corn Dodgers often showed up beside beans, stew, or fried pork, a dependable side that didn't require effort or fuss. Some cooks drizzled molasses on them, turning workhorse food into something briefly comforting. Others served them plain, trusting hunger to make anything taste good. Corn Dodgers didn't offer luxury. They offered staying power, a reminder that cowboy food wasn't about pleasure. It was about endurance. Pickled eggs. If there's one food that instantly looks like an Old West saloon, it's the jar of pickled eggs sitting behind the bar, pale, floating, and ready for anyone desperate or tough enough to try one. Pickled eggs weren't some novelty food. They were practical survival snacks. Eggs spoiled quickly without refrigeration, so saloons preserved them in vinegar brine seasoned with salt, peppercorns, mustard seed, garlic, and sometimes chili or beet juice for color. After a few days in the jar, the eggs soaked up the tangy flavor, turning into sharp, salty protein bombs that didn't require cooking or utensils. A cowboy could walk in, slap down a coin, reach into the cloudy jar, and pull out a meal in seconds. No plate, no fuss, no waiting. Pickled eggs were also the original bar-side companion to whiskey. The sour punch cut through the burn, the salt steadied the stomach. And for cowboys too broke or tired to order stew, it was just enough fuel to keep going. They weren't fancy, they weren't glamorous, but out on the frontier, they were fast food, in the most literal sense. Hardtack and gravy. Before soft biscuits and warm rolls, there was hardtack, the infamous toothbreaker of the frontier. Cowboys didn't eat it because they wanted to. They ate it because they had no choice. Hardtack was made from just flour, water, and salt, baked until it was so hard that it could survive years in a saddlebag without molding. You couldn't bite it. You couldn't tear it. Some cowboys joked it could stop a bullet. So how did saloons make this edible? Gravy. Rich, salty, smoky gravy. Saloons would soak broken pieces of hardtack in hot water or broth to soften it, then smother it with gravy made from fried salt pork drippings, flour, black pepper, and sometimes onions. The result transformed something nearly inedible into a warm, savory, stick-to-your-bones meal. To a cowboy who had spent weeks chewing jerky and dust, this was luxury. It wasn't beautiful, it wasn't fancy, but it tasted like a relief, because in the Wild West, comfort didn't come easy, but a good pan of gravy came close. Buffalo roast. Before cattle ranches took over the plains, buffalo was the heart of frontier cooking. And in some saloons, buffalo roast was considered the top-shelf meal. This wasn't a dish for drifters scraping pocket change. This was what a cowboy ordered when he had just been paid, won a hand of poker, or survived something he probably shouldn't have. Buffalo meat was leaner and richer than beef, with a deep, game-like flavor. Saloons would roast large cuts slowly over open flames or in heavy cast-iron ovens, basting them in whatever fat they could save. The most prized cut? The buffalo hump, incredibly tender when roasted low and slow. Slices were served with potatoes, beans, or a thick gravy made from the drippings. In frontier boomtowns, this was celebration food, the meal you ordered when life had gone right for once. But the popularity of buffalo roast had a dark side. The demand for meat, along with large-scale hunting, pushed buffalo to near extinction by the late 1800s. By then, buffalo roast had become rare, expensive, and almost mythical. For the cowboys who remembered it, the flavor wasn't just food. It was the taste of a West that was disappearing. Biscuits and molasses. Sometimes the simplest meals were the ones that stayed with cowboys the longest. Biscuits and molasses was one of those foods, cheap, warm, and quietly comforting after long days and cold nights. The biscuits weren't fancy. No butter, no buttermilk. Just flour, lard, salt, and water, stirred together and baked in a Dutch oven or skillet until crisp outside and soft inside. Every saloon in the West kept a batch on hand because they were quick to make and easy to serve. Molasses was the real luxury here. Thick, dark, and sweet, it poured slow like syrup and didn't spoil, making it perfect for dusty frontier shelves. A cowboy who had gone weeks on beans, salt pork, and black coffee could taste this and feel human again. Some saloons served biscuits and molasses as breakfast, some served them as dessert. But most often, they were the quiet, late-night meal for the tired men who slipped into saloons not to drink and shout, but just to sit down, breathe, and take the edge off the world for a moment. It was more than food. It was something that tasted like home, even if home was a place far behind you on the trail. Fried calf brains. In the Wild West, nothing went to waste, not even the parts most people today wouldn't dream of eating. When a steer was butchered, saloons and chuckwagon cooks used everything they could, including the brain. And, surprisingly, fried calf brains weren't considered strange back then. They were a treat. The brains were cleaned, sliced, and dipped in seasoned flour or cornmeal. Then they were fried in hot tallow or pork fat until the outside turned golden and crisp, while the inside stayed soft and creamy. The taste was mild, closer to scrambled eggs than meat, which made it easy to dress up with mustard, onions, or hot sauce. Areas with strong German, French, or Mexican influence served this dish proudly, since those food traditions were already familiar with using organ meats. To many cowboys, this was simply good cooking, rich, filling, and respectful of the animal that fed you. Some saloons even served fried calf brains for breakfast with biscuits and coffee. It didn't matter if you were a ranch hand, gambler, or lawman. If it was fried, it was food. Today it might sound surprising, but back then it was just smart frontier cooking, turning every piece into a meal. Game jerky, venison, elk, antelope. Jerky wasn't just trail food, it was saloon food too. In the early West, hunters, trappers, and ranch hands brought in dried strips of venison, elk, or antelope, and saloons were more than happy to buy, barter, or make it themselves. This jerky wasn't the soft snack bag kind we see today. It was hard, chewy, smoky, and deeply seasoned, made to last. The meat was cut into thin strips, rubbed with salt, hung near smoke, and left to dry slowly under the open sky. Sometimes it included black pepper, red pepper flakes, sage, or juniper, whatever was nearby and growing wild. Saloons often served jerky on a plate with pickles or cheese, alongside chili or stew, or just by the piece to go with whiskey. And cowboys loved it because it didn't spoil. It could be packed in a saddlebag. It kept hunger quiet for hours. Some called it trail candy. Others called it chew and think food because you had to work your jaw for every bite. But jerky wasn't just fuel, it was a symbol of frontier independence. If you had jerky, you were someone who could hunt, cure, and survive, even when the land tried to beat you back. Miner's pot pie. In towns where pickaxes and saloons stood side by side, meals had to be cheap, filling, and fast to prepare in bulk. That's where miner's pot pie fit perfectly. It was the early frontier version of comfort food. Hearty, heavy, and warm enough to push through bitter nights and long workdays. Unlike the creamy chicken pot pie we know today, this one was rougher and more rugged. The filling was made from whatever meat the cook could get, beef if lucky, rabbit or squirrel if not, simmered slowly with onions, potatoes, and any root vegetables on hand. Then the stew was poured into a thick tin pan. If the saloon had enough flour, a dough crust went over the top. If not, they just dropped biscuit dough onto the steaming stew and let it puff as it cooked. The result was thick gravy rich with meat juices, soft, tender meat that cooked for hours, dough that soaked up all the flavor. Saloons sold it by the slice or by the tin, and miners would order it after long shifts underground, coated in dust, exhausted, and desperate for a meal that felt like home. Pot pie didn't just feed the stomach. It fed the spirit of men who lived on risk, sweat, and hope. Cornmeal mush with tallow drizzle. Before grits became a diner staple, the frontier had cornmeal mush, one of the simplest and most reliable meals in the West. It didn't need fancy ingredients, only cornmeal, water, and thyme, which made it perfect for both saloons and cow camps where supplies were always tight. Cooks would simmer cornmeal slowly until it thickened into a warm, creamy porridge. When there was milk available, it became richer. When there wasn't, water worked just fine. Once cooked, the mush was poured into shallow pans to cool and set into a firm loaf. When an order came in, slices were cut and fried in a skillet until the edges turned crisp and golden. Now came the part that made it cowboy food, the tallow drizzle. Tallow, rendered beef fat, was everywhere because nothing from a slaughtered steer was wasted. A spoonful of hot tallow added warmth, richness, and enough calories to keep a cowboy standing. Some saloons sweetened the mush with molasses. Others kept it plain, sturdy, and salty, something you could eat quickly before heading back to the saddle. It wasn't glamorous, and it wasn't meant to be. Cornmeal mush was fuel, the kind that kept a ranch hand working through cold mornings, long rides, and whatever the frontier threw at him next. Wild turkey and dumplings. In the forested regions of the West, especially around the Ozarks, Appalachia, and the wooded territories of Kansas and Missouri, wild turkeys were far easier to find than cattle. And when a cowboy, trapper, or hunter brought one into town, the saloon kitchen knew exactly what to do with it. This wasn't the soft, butter-basted holiday turkey we know today. Wild turkey meat was lean, tough, and gamey, which meant it needed time. The bird was boiled slowly for hours with onions, black pepper, and any herbs the cook had, sometimes sage, sometimes just wild garlic gathered nearby. When the meat finally loosened from the bone, it was shredded and returned to the broth. Then came the dumplings. Not delicate, fluffy dumplings, these were rough spoonfuls of dough, dropped directly into the simmering pot. They puffed, thickened the broth, and turned the stew into something warm, heavy, and deeply comforting. When a plate of turkey and dumplings came out of the saloon kitchen, the room got quieter. Poker games paused, Boots stopped tapping the floorboards, because this dish felt like home. For cowboys who had spent months on the trail, for miners who hadn't seen a family table in years, for drifters who didn't know when they'd leave again, this was the closest thing to a Sunday dinner they were going to get. Dried apple pie. Fresh fruit was a luxury in the West, the kind of thing travelers bragged about, not something saloons could count on. But dried apples were different. They traveled well, lasted through heat and dust, and could be stored for months in cloth sacks or barrels. When a saloon had dried apples, it had the makings of one of the most comforting frontier desserts, dried apple pie. The apples were soaked in water to bring them back to life, slowly softening into something close to fresh fruit. Then they were cooked down with sugar, cinnamon, and sometimes a pinch of nutmeg, turning from leathery slices into a thick golden filling. The crust wasn't light or flaky like modern pastry. It was heavy, sturdy, and made from flour and lard, rolled thick to survive high heat and rough ovens. When the pie came out, the edges were crisp and browned, the center bubbling with sweet spiced apple. It didn't matter if it was served in a tin plate or a cracked ceramic bowl. For a cowboy who had lived on jerky and beans, one bite could stop time. It tasted like fall. It tasted like orchards. It tasted like a memory most men thought they had left behind for good. A slice cost more than beans or bread, but the price wasn't for food, it was for a moment of tenderness in a world that rarely offered any. Fried corn cakes, Johnny cakes. Johnny cakes were the everyday bread of the frontier, simple, sturdy, and able to be made anywhere a skillet could sit over flame. Long before saloons dotted the West, indigenous communities were already making versions of these cakes. Cowboys and settlers adopted the idea because cornmeal was cheaper, more available, and far easier to store than flour. To make Johnny cakes, a cook mixed cornmeal with boiling water and a little salt, then dropped the batter directly onto a hot griddle or skillet. The cakes fried until the edges curled and browned, giving them a crisp bite that opened into a warm, coarse center. They weren't sweet, and they weren't meant to be delicate. These were workman's bread, meant to last through dust, sweat, and exhaustion. In saloons, Johnny cakes often played the role of a plate, stew or beans spooned right over the top so nothing was wasted. When molasses or sorghum syrup was available, that turned them into something close to a treat. But most of the time, they were served plain, still hot from the skillet, filling enough to steady a drinker or fuel a rider heading back out into the cold. There was no ceremony about them, no celebration, just a warm, dependable food that said, "You have a long road ahead. Eat and keep going." Cow tongue in brown gravy. Cow tongue may sound unusual today, but in the Wild West it was considered a cut of respect. It took skill and patience to cook, which meant a saloon serving it had a real cook in the back, not just someone boiling beans in a pot. This was a dish for men who had a little extra coin in their pockets. Lawmen, gamblers, trail bosses after a long drive, or anyone celebrating a win that didn't come often. The tongue simmered for hours in a pot with onions, pepper, and whatever herbs the kitchen could get its hands on. When it was finally tender enough to peel, it was sliced, seared, and smothered in a thick brown gravy made from pan drippings and flour. The flavor was rich and deeply meaty, closer to slow-roasted beef than anything exotic. The texture was surprising, too, soft, silky, and satisfying. It was served alongside fried apples, boiled potatoes, or cornbread, depending on the region and the day. When a steaming plate of cow tongue came out of the kitchen, you didn't shovel it down. You sat and you ate, because this was not a trail meal. It was the closest thing to comfort, in places where comfort rarely existed. For some cowboys, this dish tasted like home. For others, It tasted like the one small luxury the frontier allowed. Pinto bean chili, without tomatoes. Chili in the early West didn't look like the bright red, tomato-heavy bowls we know today. On the frontier, tomatoes were seasonal, expensive, and often unavailable entirely. So saloon chili was built differently, from dried chilies pounded by hand, slow-simmered beans, and tough cuts of beef that softened over hours of cooking. This was a working man's chili, gritty, smoky, and built for stamina. Pinto beans soaked overnight until they swelled back to life. Beef was seared in rendered tallow, adding depth and richness. Then came the spices: ground ancho or pasilla peppers, wild garlic when it could be found, salt and maybe coffee to deepen the broth. No cheese, no sour cream, no frills. Just heat, meat, and time. Saloons advertised bowls of chili the way bars today advertise their best beer. A strong chili earned respect, a weak one earned ridicule. Cowboys didn't ask for it mild because mild wasn't an option. This was food meant to wake a tired man up, warm him from the inside, and keep him riding for hours afterward. Served with a slab of sourdough, hardtack, or just eaten straight with a tin spoon, this was the original bowl of red, the frontier's handshake, challenge, and welcome all at once. Bread pudding with whiskey sauce. Pudding was the kind of dessert that showed up when a saloon cook cared, or when the place had just enough leftover bread to make something warm instead of wasteful. There was nothing fancy about it. Old biscuits, stale cornbread, or hard rolls were torn into chunks and soaked in a mixture of milk, eggs, and sugar. What came out of the oven was soft, spiced, and deeply comforting, something that tasted like a memory from a kitchen far away. But the real magic was the whiskey sauce. Butter melted in a small tin pan, sugar stirred in until it browned, then a splash of whiskey, just enough to burn off the sharpness, but leave the slow warmth behind. The sauce was poured still hot over each serving so that it soaked into the pudding, sweet at first and then suddenly warm and smoky like a campfire after dark. Men who hadn't tasted a homemade dessert in years ate slowly when this was served. Conversations softened, the loudness of the room quieted just enough. For a moment, just a moment, the frontier didn't feel so hard. Bread pudding wasn't just food. It was kindness in a world where kindness was rare. Fried trout with cornmeal crust. Out in the mountain towns of Colorado, Montana, and Wyoming, saloons didn't always rely on cattle or pork. They relied on the river. Fresh trout was one of the few ingredients that didn't have to be hauled in by wagon train. It could be pulled straight from a stream that morning. That meant saloons near mining camps or logging towns often served trout as one of their few fresh meals. The preparation was simple but perfected through repetition. The fish was cleaned, gutted, and kept whole, head, bones, everything. Then it was dredged in a coarse mixture of cornmeal, salt, and black pepper. The cornmeal wasn't just seasoning, it created a crunchy, golden crust when fried in hot pork fat or tallow. The outside crackled. The inside stayed tender and flaky. It was a meal that felt almost fancy in a place where meals were usually brown, greasy, and heavy. Sometimes the trout came with fried potatoes, sometimes with pickled onions, sometimes with just a wedge of stale bread. But for a cowboy who'd spent weeks eating beans and jerky, a crisp trout fillet hot from the pan could taste like a feast. And in a saloon crowded with travelers, miners, gamblers, and cowhands, you could always tell who had ordered trout. The whole room smelled like the river. Gooseberry cobbler. Before white sugar was common, and before canned fruit lined railroad shelves, desserts in the frontier came from the land, and gooseberries were everywhere. These tart, bright berries grew wild in patches across the prairies and hills. Saloons that wanted something sweet didn't bake cake or pie first. They made gooseberry cobbler. The berries were cooked down with a bit of sugar, when it was available, to balance their natural sourness. The filling was poured into cast-iron pans and topped with rough biscuit-like dough. No precision, no delicate pastry layers, just spoonfuls of thick batter dropped onto bubbling fruit. As it baked, the top crisped and browned, while the bottom softened into the jammy filling. The result was sweet, sour, warm, and deeply comforting. Cowboys who grew up on farms or frontier cabins recognized the flavor immediately. It tasted like summer, like family, like a world where life wasn't always dust and distance. Gooseberry cobbler wasn't everyday food. It was something you ordered when you wanted to feel human again. Scrapple. Scrapple came to the West the same way many cowboys did, from the mid-Atlantic states and Pennsylvania Dutch communities that pushed westward. It was a practical dish. Everything left after butchering a hog, scraps, organ meat, trimmings, was simmered down, mixed with cornmeal and spices, and cooled into a firm loaf. Once set, it was sliced and fried until crisp on the outside and soft inside. In Wild West saloons, scrapple was breakfast for men who worked before sunrise. Miners grabbed it on their way underground. Cattle hands ordered it after an all-night ride. Railroad workers ate it before another day of hammering steel. It could be served plain, or with molasses, mustard, or a fried egg when times were good. Scrapple wasn't about prestige. It wasn't about taste experiments. It was about survival, about making sure no part of the hog went to waste and no man went to work hungry. And in a world where everything was earned the hard way, scrapple was respected because it filled you up and kept you standing.